Hey everyone, Jim here. Thanks so much for joining us. This week, we're going to do something a little bit different, as we've had so many new subscribers over the past few months, and we're very busy right now prepping and launching our Halloween season, which is going to run from September 28th to November 3rd in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto. All of the information can be found on our website, hauntedwalk.com. We thought it would be a great time to bring back one of our favorite episodes, and it's perhaps my favorite creepy, unexplainable historical story, the Dyatlov Pass incident. If you've never heard of this story, you are in for a treat. We'll be back next week with a new episode, but in the meantime, enjoy our trip to the Russian mountains. Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of the Haunted Walk, offering thematic walking tours in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director of the company, and I really appreciate you joining us for today's show. We hope your new year is off to a great start and that all of your resolutions are still firmly intact. Before we go any further, I must warn you, this episode will not be for the faint of heart. In doing this podcast and working at the Haunted Walk over close to 15 years, I've had the opportunity to explore countless bizarre or hard-to-explain events. And I don't think a story has chilled or perplexed me as much as the topic of this episode, the Dyatlov Pass incident. In the middle of a freezing cold Russian night in the Ural Mountains, 9 young, fit, and experienced long-distance cross-country skiers cut their way out of their own tent, fleeing into the dark without jackets and many with bare feet. That night, the temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 Fahrenheit. What could possibly explain this course of action? And furthermore, what could possibly explain the inexplicable condition the bodies were found in? In late January of 1959, a group of students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute headed out on an expedition to trek 350 kilometers on skis through the forests and northern Urals. The group originally consisted of 10 people, 8 men and 2 women. Most were between the ages of 21 and 24, and all had previous experience with long-distance skiing. The leader of the group, the man for whom the pass was eventually named, Igor Dyatlov, he had completed the exact same trip the previous year. 3 days before the incident took place, one of the male members of the team was forced to head back due to illness. He would be the only person from the team to survive, and the last person to see his friends alive. One of the great frustrations with this mystery is how long it actually took to get a search party out and looking for these skiers. And this is because the leader of the team, Igor Dyatlov, had been telling people that maybe it would take a little bit longer for them to complete the journey. So the date they would be finishing kind of became up in the air, and this led to a full 8 days passing by before a search started to take place. After a week of searching the wilderness, tracks made by the group, their ski tracks, were discovered, and they were able to be followed all the way to their abandoned tent. The first irregularity was the location they had chosen for their campsite. It was made near the top of a mountain, known as Dead Mountain, which they were not supposed to be on. Now, I will point out this Mountain of the Dead, or Dead Mountain, comes from a Mansi name for it, and the Mansi were the native peoples that lived in the area. Now, when they referred to it as Dead Mountain, that may sound quite ominous. But the research seems to indicate that they called it this simply because nothing really grew or lived there. There was no game to be found. There was no reason to go up the mountain. It was a dead mountain. Now, the fact that this was off the route, many believe it was because of the worsening weather conditions they faced on that final day, with snowstorms and really decreased visibility. They somehow lost their direction and deviated west, which put them up near the top of Dead Mountain. When they realized their mistake, likely later in the day, the group decided to stop and set up camp, likely for the night, with their plan to course correct in the morning. The volunteer searcher who found the tent said it was half torn down and covered with snow. It was empty, and all of the group's belongings and shoes had been left behind. An examination of the tent revealed there were 2 different kinds of cuts made into the canvas fabric. There were small, short slashes made roughly at eye level, and large gashes that stretched the full height of the tent. What's so fascinating is that all of these cuts were made from the inside, as if the group suddenly needed to escape very quickly and did not have time to undo the many buttons that held the front of the tent closed. As mentioned by the volunteer, the group left behind in the tent their jackets, flashlights, blankets, food, water, the majority of their knives, axes, and a variety of other items that could have been life-saving. They also left behind cameras and diaries, which would become instrumental in trying to put the pieces together later. Keith McCloskey is a Dyatlov expert and has visited the site and written 2 books on the topic: 2013's Mountain of the Dead, the Dyatlov Pass Incident, and 2016's Journey to Dyatlov Pass, an explanation of the mystery. In a 2013 interview on Coast to Coast AM, he shared his thoughts on the case, and particularly those first few terrifying moments.
Well, it was the conditions were terrible. The temperatures were, it was minus 26. I mean, I get cold when it hits freezing, and they've hardly got any protective gear on against that. The snow was up to 1 meter deep. If you're not wearing shoes, or some of them weren't even wearing socks, you're walking around in that, you're not going to last too long. It must have been, whatever it was, must have frightened them to death, literally, that they ran away to their certain deaths, because anybody who was rational enough, they knew what they were doing, in the sense that they were experienced mountaineers or skiers, if you like, and they must have known the effects of what the cold, extreme cold, will do to your body, and they ignored all that inner advice, if you like, and just took their chance. But it's almost like a man throwing himself out of a 20-story burning building. He's almost certainly going to die, but he doesn't want to be burnt by the flames. But it's death whichever way you look at it.
Outside of the tent, the searchers found 8 or 9 sets of footprints, left by people who were only wearing socks, a single shoe, or were even barefoot. The single file tracks could be followed, leading down towards the edge of a nearby wood. Only the hikers' footprints were visible. No other kind of footprints were found, and there were no signs of a struggle or people having any difficulty walking. The footprints seemed to indicate they rather calmly walked in a straight line. Following the direction of the tracks, searchers found the remains of 2 male team members at the edge of the woods, about 1.5 kilometers or just under a mile from the campsite. The 2 men were found under a large cedar tree, beside a small fire, shoeless and dressed only in their underwear. Both had died of hypothermia, and the burns found on their hands and feet likely indicate they burned them in the fire while succumbing to the cold. The cedar tree directly above their bodies had the branches broken off to a height of 5 meters, or about 16 feet. The branches of the tree would not have been good to use for burning, and much drier wood was readily available in the area. Skin cells found on the higher points of the tree indicate at least one person had climbed it, and likely in a hurry. Why would someone climb a tree while they are freezing to death? Were they trying to see what was happening back at the tent? Or were they trying to hide or get away from something or someone? As the search continued, the next 3 skiers were found between the tent and the forest. The position of the bodies seemed to indicate they were headed back to the campsite. The closest was one of the women, and she made it about halfway back to the tent before becoming overcome, despite the fact she was one of the best dressed for winter in the group. She officially died of hypothermia, but had a number of injuries, including a long, bright red bruise, 29 by 6 centimeters, in the lumbar region on the right side of her torso that looks like it would be caused by the strike from a baton. The 2 men found with her had injuries to both of their hands, consistent with hand-to-hand combat. One of the man's jackets was also unbuttoned, which is extremely unusual given they were fighting the cold to stay alive. He had no internal injuries. The other man was much better dressed. However, his skull had a 6-centimeter fracture, and he had significant damage around his temples, which likely would not have killed him, but would have significantly disoriented him and likely sped up the hypothermia. His injury pattern is the reverse of what we would usually expect to see in injuries suffered by a freezing man in the last minutes of his life. It looks as if he repeatedly fell on his face as he was walking, and every time he fell, he managed to hit the sides of his head. This is unusual for a man who was probably in the best shape of anyone in the group. Even a long ski trip could hardly be responsible for this alleged clumsiness. And this man's body was the only one that had ice underneath it. This means that when his body fell, he was relatively still warm, and there was a noticeable heat exchange into the environment. Almost 2 months later, the final 4 members of the team were found. They were discovered by a crudely made shelter in a ravine. They had even covered the ground of the shelter with cedar branches, seemingly in an attempt to give them something to sit on that was not the ice and snow. They were the best dressed of all of the survivors, and it does seem likely they took the clothes off the 2 men found at the cedar tree after they had perished. 3 of the 4 individuals found in the ravine had suffered fatal internal injuries, including broken ribs and skull fractures. All of these injuries without the presence of external wounds that would have explained them. One of the more shocking elements is that a woman with this group had her tongue seemingly removed. It was not there, while the rest of her face did not show any damage you would expect if an animal had somehow taken it away. The doctor with the investigation that had examined the remains stated that the injuries of these people could not have been caused by another human being because the force of the blows had been too strong and no soft tissue damage had occurred. One observer describes their condition as if they were in a car crash. So after all the remains had been discovered, the autopsies completed, the diaries reviewed, the photographs in the cameras they found have been developed, and you can view a lot of these photographs online. None of them indicate exactly what happened on the night of the incident, but they do answer a few questions and provide some context. By all accounts, the group was in good spirits and good health the day the attack took place. There's a photo of them building the shelter in the campsite. We know from the examination of the contents of their stomachs that it seems all of the individuals died somewhere around 6 to 8 hours after their last meal. So if we can imagine them eating sometime in the early evening, it's likely the incident started unfolding sometime between 9 p.m. and midnight. Now, what exactly happened in those first few moments that caused such panic that they had to cut their way out of the tent is still a matter of debate, and we'll certainly talk about the theories in a few moments. But it does seem from the short, stabbing kind of cuts in the tent that it's likely they were looking out at something. And at some point they decided they had to flee for their lives. What else could possibly explain why they did not take their coats and jackets and just the basic tools of survival? Again, minus 30 degrees Celsius when they cut themselves out of the tent and go into the dark, a lot of them barefoot and without appropriate clothing and supplies. We can't be entirely sure the order in which the deaths occurred, but we do know, based on the fact that the two men who died by the cedar tree had their clothes reappropriated by the group to try to stay warm, indicates they were likely the first ones to go. And for the three that died on their way back to the tent, it is absolutely perplexing to consider what kept them away from their campsite, their supplies, their jackets, their boots, for 8 hours and had them on literally the edge of death. It was they were walking back up the hill towards the tent. Why did they wait so long before going back? There are many theories as to what may be responsible for these series of events, ranging from, I guess, a more of a mundane approach where unfortunate circumstances compounded and they died as a result, ranging all the way to much more extreme examples which invoke UFOs and the supernatural. We'll try to work our way through some of the theories and see what holds up and what doesn't. What I find so frustrating is that there are none of these that I'm able to put much faith into. One of the most common explanations is that an avalanche occurred. With the group all gathered together in their common tent, they suddenly heard the sound of an avalanche. Or the avalanche occurred, burying them in, and they had to cut their way out. So either they fled from an avalanche or an avalanche had occurred. What makes this fairly unlikely is that the tent location was only about 300 meters from the top of the mountain. So there wouldn't be much force from an avalanche at that distance. Also, when we think about a mountain, we kind of maybe imagine a really steep slope, but the area they were actually camping on here wasn't quite flat, but it was close to flat. There were also no visible signs to the searchers that an avalanche had taken place in the area. And the fact that things like the tent poles were still up, you think they would have been knocked down. The skis were still up, stuck in the snow in an upright position. You think they would be knocked down as well. And the damage really seemed to only be in the center of the tent. But if an avalanche had occurred, would it keep them away from the tent for hours? Would they not try to go back and get their supplies? An avalanche could possibly explain the massive internal injuries found on 3 of the victims in the ravine. But it's worth noting that we do see a single file line of footprints from the tent of 8 or 9 people heading in one direction, and without any sign of any struggle or anyone laboring. So you do wonder if someone suffered such profound internal injuries, even if they didn't die instantly in the tent when the avalanche occurred, the chances of them being able to walk in a straight line on their own in their bare feet, well, maybe that gets a little harder to believe. Is it possible those in the ravine died by way of an avalanche that occurred later and they were caught and swept into the ravine? It's possible, but combined with the other elements like the missing tongue, it doesn't quite seem to fit. A kind of add-on to that theory is that they suffered from avalanche paranoia, which is perhaps they were hearing sounds they thought were an avalanche all night. They're sitting in the tent there. The anxiety's building. The paranoia is building. And at some point, they kind of snap. But again, that doesn't explain why they stayed away from so long when the tent seemingly was still accessible. And the chances of all of them succumbing to that paranoia at the exact same time, perhaps a little hard to believe. Another obvious line of thought to explore: is it possible this was some type of wild animal attack? Some type of large creature, maybe a pack of wolves? I mean, you can go all the way into the more bizarre, something like a yeti, the abominable snowman, some type of large forest creature not yet discovered. That an animal somehow caused these injuries to the group, or a group of these animals, scared them off in some way. What makes that theory perhaps not overly likely is really the lack of any type of other tracks. No animal tracks were found in the area. And as we mentioned earlier, it's known as Dead Mountain because there's not really any game to be found up there. There were also no bite marks on the body. So if you think there were animals nearby who were hungry and looking for food, and they managed to get one of these humans on the ground, or after one of the humans died, you would expect to see some type of bite marks or scratching or clawing. Also of note is just the numbers. There were 9 humans there, and in the tent with them, they had axes and knives. They had some means to defend themselves, but whatever the threat was, perceived or real, they obviously felt they didn't stand a chance using their basic weapons and their numbers, and still fled. The first theory to be seriously entertained by the authorities was that Mansi tribesmen, the native peoples that lived in the area, had committed some type of attack on the group because they had violated a sacred site, gone onto their sacred land by accident, and that this was a type of a retribution. Now, it's not without precedent, as I believe it was 10 years earlier or so, a Mansi shaman did kill a geologist that wandered on to their territory. But there are a few facts that make that probably not very likely. One, the area they were in and the route they were taking was a well-known route used by skiers and outdoor enthusiasts. So it wasn't like they were the first people to suddenly be in this area. As mentioned, the leader of the group, Igor Dyatlov, made the trip the year before. If the Mansi did kill them, it's pretty surprising they would not take all their supplies, the warm clothes, the food. Would they leave that stuff behind? And I guess a more, primal question is, well, why would they do it? Would this perceived transgression be enough to kill 9 people? What further depreciates the Mansi involvement in my mind is that they really did help with the search as well. So perhaps they're playing both sides, but also being an active participant in trying to find the group, I think makes them less likely as being the ones involved. Another theory that has some support is that the group ran into escaped prisoners from a nearby gulag. Now, those are the forced labor concentration camps where Russians would send criminals and political dissidents. And the group became unknowingly witnesses to this escape and were subsequently killed. Now, the gulags were very, very difficult places, and people would be highly motivated to escape. And those who did escape would often have an experience in the Second World War, or, they would have the means and the ability to kill people, maybe if it came to that. But you have to imagine if you've escaped from a prison and you're going to try to hide out in the wilderness, as these prisoners would have done. They didn't go towards civilization, they went kind of in the opposite direction. Well, if you had killed these people, you would certainly take all of their supplies if you're trying to hold out, because likely in your escape, you wouldn't manage to have much with you. So why would you bypass the opportunity to take their warm jackets, take their food? It seems unlikely you would do that. Also, again, there were 9 of them. How many of these escaped prisoners would there need to be? And where are their footprints, if that was the case? I don't think it makes a great deal of sense for these escaped prisoners, or the Mansi either, that they would not take the clothing, but refuse to allow the skiers to put on their boots and things like that. It just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Some have suggested that the group was trying to defect, and this was their escape plan out of Russia. But this would be a very, very difficult way to try to do that. And by all accounts, including from the member of the team that survived, these were all happy people, not really looking for that type of experience, certainly as far as he knew. When we've looked at and rejected the mundane explanations to the situation, we do need to broaden our scope. And some people suggest that perhaps the group became the victims of a military experiment, that some type of weaponry, new advanced weaponry, was being tested on these people that led to this dreadful outcome. And one of the suggestions is that infrasound was used on the group in their tent. Now, if you're not familiar with infrasound, it is a very low frequency sound that we can't hear or only quite hear, that scientists believe does cause a reaction in our nervous system. It can make us feel things like dread, terror, awe. We feel something without knowing why. And some suggest that perhaps some type of infrasound technology was used to create a real sense of agitation inside the tent, causing them to flee. The evidence on whether infrasound actually works is still a bit ongoing. The science maybe isn't quite settled on that, but let's assume that it is. To create this reaction within 9 people in this space would take significant technology and just significant size of that technology. One expert describes you'd need about a 40-foot apparatus to even attempt this if they had the technology at that time. And the only way to get equipment that large up onto the mountain would be by helicopter, which would be expensive and complicated. And furthermore, nothing like that has been found in the area or any type of indication that large machinery was present. Now, it's certainly possible there was some weaponry that could produce the paranoia in the group, that could cause the massive internal injuries we see of 3 of the 4 who were in the ravine, and startle the group or cause them to be in fear of their lives that they don't go back for their vital supplies. Certainly that's all possible. Hard to speculate on it because we have no idea what types of technology may or may not have been used. There's just not a lot of physical evidence to back that up. But there are a few very interesting facts around the investigation that might give us pause. Is it possible that the group stumbled upon a military experiment, died intentionally or unintentionally, and then the military attempted to cover it up? I'll let Keith McCloskey explain some of the very intriguing evidence he found around this topic.
There's a pilot. There's testimony from a pilot who, one of the first guys that supposedly flew over the thing, his account of what he saw on the ground is different from what makes it into the official files. Can you explain that?
He says he flew over and saw the tent the day before it was discovered. He was required to sign a non-disclosure agreement as well after the investigation, as were virtually everybody involved in it. It blows the whole theory out of the water as to the fact that they died on that mountain. He said it looked like there were people around it. You could see a couple of dead bodies. So he thought that they discovered they'd already discovered the tent. But he feared for his life, though, eventually. If you believe the testimony of the pilot, the whole stage was being set the day, in the couple of days before it was found by the search parties. There's some thought that possibly they wanted, one of the reasons why search parties weren't sent out sooner is that they knew what was going on. that they had died, and they died in an accident or however they died, and they were basically buying time to try and come up with some plausible scenario to say, well, it's okay, we found them. Here's the tent, it's been cut to ribbons, they've all died in very strange circumstances. We'll call it an unknown elemental force, and that'll be the end of it. Because one of the strangest things about the whole case is they found the remaining 4 bodies by the snowhole with dreadful injuries between the 3rd and the 5th of May, and the case was closed on the 5th of May. Lev Ivanov was ordered to just close it all. You could say, well, they found the remaining 4 bodies, so let's close the case, so it's game over. But if this was say, I don't know, in the West, in the UK or in America, and say, well, we found the 4 remaining bodies, and some of them have got absolutely horrendous internal injuries.
The fact that the case file seemed to open before the tent was found, and that the case was closed on the very same day that the final bodies were discovered, is certainly suspicious. And the fact that there is an eyewitness who observed the scene from the air the day before the searchers found the tent, reporting seeing people in the area and bodies there on the ground, it certainly does raise eyebrows. It's worth pointing out that in 2008, the 6 remaining searchers from 1959 and 31 technical experts met at Ural Polytechnic and reviewed all of the available evidence. What they believed is the group inadvertently entered a covert military testing ground and paid for it with their lives. That is possibly why the military has been so secretive about this case, as even to this day there's documents that are missing, are being withheld, or simply have been destroyed. There's also one small note I haven't mentioned which ties into this theory, and that's that 2 of the people found in the ravine near that crude shelter, their clothing did have higher than expected levels of radiation, which is quite strange. And also the lead investigator on the case very early on was using a Geiger counter as part of the search. It seems somewhat suspicious, as a Geiger counter would not normally be used, I don't think, in a search operation. In his final interview, the surviving member of the group also points out a very strange item that was found in the tent, called an obmoktki, or something to that effect. It's a wide piece of clothing that is typically wrapped around feet or legs to keep them warm. They have a very distinct shape and are made from a particular material. They were widely used among soldiers in the 40s and 50s, and later by the prisoners of Stalin's concentration camps. Nobody knows how this item of clothing got there and in the tent. The existence of this item was noticed in a photograph that was taken. But the evidence itself, that piece of clothing, has since gone missing and has disappeared from the evidence room. The only survivor also says there were a pair of glasses and skis in some of those final photos that did not belong to anyone in the group. Is it possible he has made a mistake, he does not remember, talking about 30, 40 years ago when he gave this interview, and they did in fact belong to someone in the group and he just was not aware or did not remember? I mean, that's certainly a possibility. It's also a possibility somebody else was in that tent. Could the military have arrived before the search party, or could they have moved the bodies to that site? What prevents me from really embracing this theory is that if the military was trying to keep something secret, why would they move the remains or leave the remains with such conspicuous injuries and positioning? Anyone who found those bodies would quickly come upon the mystery of what happened to them. So if they were trying to be discreet, you think they may have taken another course of action. Perhaps they were hoping the snow would just eventually cover them and they would be lost. But they must have also considered people would be looking for them. And to kind of leave them the way they did, if that's what happened, indicates either real sloppiness, a desire to hide the truth by making the situation so confusing and complex, or perhaps they weren't involved at all. There is one final theory to look at that is perhaps the most frightening, and that is that the skiers ran into something otherworldly. And that could range from something like a UFO to something more supernatural. I'll let Keith McCloskey explain why the UFO angle must be considered.
You know, the thing is, I'll be totally honest with you here. I mean, I've never really gone into UFOs in the past, but the more I looked at this, it's what's happened to them is almost inexplicable. You think, because I've been a student of Soviet military history, the danger is what you have is a pet theory. You know a subject, you think, oh yeah, this is what happened, and then you try and make the facts fit the case, if you like. But when I looked at, say, a Soviet military accident, which is a possibility, but there's a lot of things don't add up about that either. The Luda's tongue, for instance, that's missing. You think, well, how would that have disappeared, or how would that have come out if it was a Soviet military accident? Again, the other members of the group who died of the cold, how does that fit in with the theory of a Soviet military accident? But then you start looking at the UFO theory, and you have to think, well, there's one of the things about UFOs is when they do, if they are probing Earth, they're going to look for what defenses there are. And that whole region of the Urals is literally crawling with military facilities. There's plutonium processing plants. Only 70-odd miles away from the Dyatlov Pass is a nuclear warhead storage area. There's missiles, nuclear-tipped missiles there, all sorts of production facilities for tanks and aircraft. It's the whole area is just crawling with military. And it could be that a UFO involvement is maybe probing to see what's in the area.
Did the chief investigator, he says, when he's asked years later, he says, I think UFOs did it. Did he explain? Yeah. Did he explain any further than that?
Well, when they were investigating, there's two aspects to that. One is the light orbs. There was light orbs seen over the area but on the night they died. Nobody can explain what these orbs are. People say they were rockets. Well, they weren't rockets because the only rockets they could have been was ICBMs, and there weren't any launches of ICBMs on around that date. Furthermore, it's hundreds of miles from the missile lanes. All those types of rockets were launched from much further south at the Cosmodrome at Baikonur, and they all went east to the Kamchatka Peninsula. They didn't go anywhere near the Urals, so it's not rockets. Some people say, well, it could be meteorological phenomena, but nobody's been able to explain what meteorological phenomena. There was definite light orbs, and they were seen by members of the Mansi, and the military had seen them in the previous months as well. Other groups of hikers had seen them, and the light orbs that were seen the night they died were also seen by a group that was about 30 kilometers south of where they were. They'd also seen the orbs. And people were saying this to Lev Ivanov, the Mansi, had said they'd seen the orbs. And I think that's where he developed his theory from. And he also found marks on some of the trees at the bottom of the tree line, which looked as if they had a kind of burn mark, but a kind of, not like a normal burn with no epicenter to it, but as if a beam of energy had been directed on the tree trunk to create a round burn mark, as if it was focused on individual things, like some kind of beam, directed energy beam. And I think that's where he started formulating his theory. But again, that's as far as it goes. There's no tracks or other evidence of it.
The UFO or alien theory does check a lot of boxes. We can imagine the presence of something unknown like that causing immense fear in the group. We see the damage that was done to some of the bodies. We can imagine perhaps some technology we're not aware of. With other eyewitnesses observing strange lights in the air on that night, not far from the location the Dyatlov group was at, it's really quite chilling. If not aliens, could it be some supernatural force? A ghost? A demon? Some type of thing like that? Well, certainly that's a possibility as well when we see the fear and kind of the physical damage and the actions, particularly not returning back to the tent for some reason, to the point they died. Maybe some type of phenomenon that occurred directly inside their tent that they fled from. It's possible. But there again, there's very little actual physical evidence other than the injuries to the bodies themselves, which really give us any indication something like that happened. If I had to give you my personal theory on it, I'm not even sure which one I'd go with. The fact they didn't take their clothing is so bizarre. The fact they calmly walked in a straight line from the tent, starting down the mountain. Why would they do that? Were they possibly like prisoners held at gunpoint? But if that's the case, where are the tracks? Why are the injuries where they are? Why are the supplies still left in the tent? The thought of one of the members scrambling up that big cedar tree where the two undressed men were found. What possible reason is there to climb a tree other than to escape or to try to see what was happening back at the tent? Is it possible this was all a series of unfortunate events, perhaps involving an avalanche, perhaps involving the group getting lost or disoriented in the dark? Could there be mundane explanations? Yes. The trouble is they seem just as likely or just as believable as some of the more outlandish ones, like a government cover-up or UFOs. I did mention to someone just today that if I ever have a time machine, I'm going back to the Ural Mountains in 1959 to try to see what happened there. Because this is honestly one of the most perplexing and frightening cases I've ever investigated. For those of you interested in the case, there's a lot more information here that I simply didn't have time to go into. There are a lot more weird things, a lot more evidence that could be considered. We'd be very interested to hear if any of you have your own theories or which theory you believe about what happened to these unfortunate skiers. Please feel free to reach out to us with those on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat, all at Haunted Walk. Or feel free to reach out to me if you have any show ideas or a real in-depth theory you'd love to share. You can always reach me at jim@hauntedwalk.com. If you're enjoying the show, it would be an absolute pleasure to get a 5-star review from you on iTunes or wherever you listen to the show. And be sure to subscribe so you know when the new episodes are coming out. Information about our tours or other fun things we were up to, including hiring, can be found on our website, hauntedwalk.com. Until we meet again, sweet dreams. Special thanks to our audio editor, Michelle Dennis, to our expert guest wrangler, Jillian Walkerchuk, and Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for the additional music.